Such a joy for me, and I know for all of you, to be here on a night of manifold blessings. What a beautiful, beautiful thing. I returned, speaking of return, as these guys were, I returned from serving as, by the way, I thought of a silent sermon. And so did you, tell the truth. I returned from serving as a delegate to the World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem 3 weeks ago. At first, the 3-week gap between an unforgettable experience and tonight's reflection felt like a long wait. But in retrospect, the time in between has allowed me to continue processing. So here we go. First, a word about timing. The last living Israeli hostages were released on October 13th. The World Zionist Congress official proceedings began on October 28th. Every Israeli I encountered that week of the Congress said some version of, "We feel like we can breathe again." That statement was not a delusion that the conflict was over. It was not in disregard of the families who still awaited the return of their loved ones' remains, nor a naive claim that Israel's manifold challenges had somehow magically evaporated. It was certainly not a statement of unequivocal joy, but it was a statement of a weight lifted, of the power of the reunions we all saw, of lives forever changed and now entering new chapters. Technically, that had nothing to do with resolutions and compromises and amendments, but it was ever present and indelible during our experience. A reminder of what the World Zionist Congress is and of your role in it. The Congress gathers every 5 years as the parliament of the Jewish people for two essential functions. Number one, we vote on resolutions which, while not binding, give the Israeli government and various governmental and quasi-governmental organizations a sense of the pulse of Jewish leadership on vital issues facing Israel and the diaspora, some of which involve recommendations for funding. Second, though not happening on the floor of the convention, the Congress is the center of intense horse trading related to the establishment of a coalition agreement which determines the allocation of seats and power in what are called Israel's national institutions: the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish Agency for Israel, which determine the allocation of billions of dollars of funds each year. Who sits on those bodies and in what proportion is vitally important. Since 2021, when far-right religious nationalists developed majority control of the World Zionist Organization, there's been a marked increase in funding for settlements in the West Bank and a decrease in funding for expressions of Jewish pluralism in Israel, that is, for reform and conservative communities. So your role is to do what many of you did, to vote for the vote reform slate, which allowed our slate to send 33 delegates to the Congress, the largest single slate represented. Your vote allowed us to represent Reform Jewish values, to continue to advocate for an Israel that is Jewish, just, and secure, hewing to values of democracy and pluralism. Those values guided every one of our votes on the 30 resolutions that worked through committees to come to the plenary. But before I describe some of those resolutions, just a little bit of a math review. Some of this we did in the spring. As you might remember, even though vote reform garnered the most votes in the election and the most votes historically for any slate, we actually earned fewer seats in 2025 than we did in 2020 because the number of overall voters also increased, with a number of smaller Orthodox organizations also garnering seats. So even though we won more votes than anyone else or ever before, because the pie had grown, our number of delegates shrank from 39 to 33. That's important to note because it tells you that we went into the Congress in somewhat of a weakened position. And that is why it is remarkable that we won on every significant issue we cared about, on something like 28 out of the 30 resolutions overall, and often by wide margins. We succeeded in calling for a state commission of inquiry to look into the strategic failures of October 7th. We succeeded in calling for funding to reopen the egalitarian section of the Kotel. We succeeded in calling for an equal enlistment law, which calls for an end to the exemption to army service for the ultra-Orthodox. We succeeded in passing resolutions calling for gender equity in the national institutions, calling for the safety of Reform Jewish communities that have suffered vandalism and attacks from far-right Jewish groups. We defeated resolutions calling for further extending Israel's sovereignty over the Temple Mount and throughout the West Bank, and passed a resolution that would prevent settlement in the area known as E1, where the only goal or purpose of settlement would be to forever preclude any meaningful separation agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. We passed resolutions addressing anti-Semitism, strengthening youth movements, and establishing the creation of a national mental health task force for citizens and soldiers coping with trauma after October 7th. How did we end up winning so broadly after entering in a weakened position? I think there are two primary reasons. Number one, the right-wing groups, even though they were more numerous, were fractured. Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party is deeply divided within itself, and so they could not benefit from their strength in numbers. Second, I believe that our principles spoke deeply to the center. Groups like Hadassah and Maccabi International, along with Israeli centrist parties, consistently sided with our call for the democratic and inclusive values of the Israeli Declaration of Independence that we hold so dear, and those values kept our coalition united. The other thing that happened, and I did not learn this until this morning, is that as we gained more and more strength with the votes on the plenary floor, continuing to win our positions, it actually gave more and more strength to our negotiators who were doing the horse trading in the rooms down the hall. I had thought until I learned this that the resolution enterprise and the coalition enterprise were separate, that we were like, beefing over resolutions and amendments while the real work was going on in the closed rooms. But I learned in a presentation from our lead negotiator that, in fact, those two processes, the resolutions and amendments we were duking it out about on the plenary floor, and the negotiation for the coalition, were not separate but closely related. Each time we won a vote on the floor, it gave more leverage to our representatives who were negotiating for those seats and funding from national institutions. In the end, and I mean in the end, as in last week, 2 weeks after the Congress ended, the negotiators were finally able to reach a coalition agreement, and once again, it was a victory for us, our partners, and our principles. That same lead negotiator reported this week that if we had ended up with 31 or 32 seats instead of 33, we would not have prevailed in all the ways we did. So thank you. Your engagement, your participation, and your activism have made a huge difference. And they will again as we build towards the World Zionist Congress in 2030. In the opening lines of this week's Torah portion, we learn that Rebekah is pregnant with twins, and the pregnancy is difficult. Vayitrotzatzu habanim b'kirba vatomer im kain lama zeh anochi. But the children struggled in her womb, and she said, if this is what it's going to be like, why do I even exist? I will confess that I had some Rebekah moments at the World Zionist Congress. The struggles were mighty and not always pretty. The World Zionist Congress is in some ways bare-knuckled politics, and it is not for the faint of heart. The evening plenary that was the culmination of a lot of hard work repeatedly devolved into chaos. But overall, it was inspiring. Inspiring to note that even when I found myself in profound disagreement with people, many of them had Israel's best interest in mind, even if their definition of best interest might be radically different from mine. Our debate in America has too often fallen into false binaries. Some folks on the left claim that you can't support Israel and claim to support human rights at the same time. Some folks on the right claim that any support for coexistence is a betrayal of Israel's survival. Those binaries are not our friends. That's why it was inspiring to see young Jews from all over the world standing up for Israel and democratic values. One of the most eloquent spokespeople in our coalition was a 20-something from France, and another was a 20-something from the holy city of Cleveland. I had a meaningful hallway conversation with an Orthodox representative from the East Coast of the United States, and then saw him act deplorably when a woman rabbi was leading the plenary. I learned from some young Israeli political staffers who took no prisoners in arguing for our shared convictions. And when things did get discouraging, when the flaws in the system were in full display, and the struggle between brothers felt deeply painful, we reminded each other again and again how important it is to have a seat at the table, even when the table is flawed. We will not advance the cause by walking away. While the plenary definitely felt like a zoo, my committee meeting earlier in the day was a different story. Every delegate to the Congress is assigned to one of 10 committees, and those committees first deliberated the resolutions that eventually came to the plenary floor. My committee was the Committee on Sovereignty and Borders, so you can imagine that things got a bit heated. The 30 of us sitting around the table could not have been more diverse, from left to right, religious to secular, and everywhere in between. The arguments in committee were passionate, heartfelt, and vehement. But in the 4 hours we spent in a closed room, I don't think I heard a single insult. We debated ideas and principles and propositions without personal attack. It felt like the best of politics. And so this is my favorite memory from the Congress, which I've already shared with some of you. At the committee table, I was sitting next to an Orthodox woman from an organization called World Emanu-El, a women's organization that focuses on social services in Israel, but also shares a lot of political overlap with the religious right and the settler movement. We were doing all of the voting on our phones, and at one point, she lost track of which amendment we were voting on. So she turned to me and asked, "David, how are you voting on this one?" And I said, "I am voting for." She said, "So I'm voting against, right?" And I said, "Right." We know Rebecca's question. If this struggle is so great and the pain so real, why bother? And the answer was at that table. Because at the end of the day, if we want Israel to be what it can be, we have to be present for the struggle. If we believe in the possibility of security for Israel and peace with our Palestinian neighbors in some sort of just and secure agreement, we have to be at the table. If we believe in the rehabilitation of Israel's suffering society, if we believe in relief for the suffering in Gaza, then we have to be at the table. If we believe in an Israel where every Jew can feel at home, we have to be at the table. If we believe in an Israel that actively prosecutes and prevents settler violence in the West Bank and upholds the dignity of every inhabitant, then we have to be at the table. If we believe that maybe we get better and not worse by fighting a way to listen to viewpoints that make us crazy, then we have to be at the table. Thank you for making that seat at the table possible for me and for all the delegates who represented you. Shabbat Shalom.